We could add foundation to our pen, add external CSS, so you can paste in any hosted style sheet, or you can quick add some of the really common ones like foundation. So I'll do that. Why not? And then under JavaScript, I can do some things like add React, quick add React, and React DOM. We will eventually be using package management to add our dependencies as opposed to actually putting script tags in our document. But this effectively puts the script tags for React itself and React DOM, because React will also run natively on some mobile platforms and stuff like that. It doesn't have to be the web, but React DOM is React for the web, which is what we're doing, of course. And to use JSX, as well as to use the absolute latest versions of JavaScript, even newer than ES6, we're going to need to use a preprocessor called Babel. So JSX is not part of the JavaScript standard, part of the ECMAScript standard. So browsers do not understand it and quite possibly never will. It's not on track to become a standard or anything. So you have to run it through Babel to translate it down to the actual JavaScript that it produces. So all of those JSX lines are getting turned to React.createElement behind the scenes by Babel. But that's horrible to write. So Babel lets us write it the way we want it to and translates it into real JavaScript. And that also means we can use the absolute bleeding edge of the ECMAScript standard. So having done all of those things, we should be able to use React in here. On the HTML side, you don't have to put the head and body and so on in CodePen. You just put the body. I'm going to put one element, just one lousy stinking element. I'm just going to put a main element. I just have to put something that I can target in a selector. I'm not going to bother with any CSS. And that's all the HTML we will do, so I'm going to go ahead and minimize that and just work on JavaScript. So we need to create a class. I'll call it app, capital A. We always name our classes with capital letters. And it will extends React.component. Which means we inherit all of its functionality. We will have to have a render function. You always have to have a render function in a component. In this case, since it's a class, I should say render method, just like we've always done. And that needs to return some JSX. So let's return some. Now then, for something to actually happen on the page, we have to have one little line here, React DOM.render. You will most likely only have one of these for an entire application, not per component. And to render this component, since it's called app, we basically put an app tag. And since it will have no contents, everything gets passed in as props and stuff, we just use a self-closing tag by putting a slash before the closing angle bracket. So that's an XML thing. In HTML, we don't have to put self-closing tags, but in XML you must. And since JSX is actually XML, not HTML, empty elements have to be self-closing, and they have to dress themselves too. So that's what we want to render, that component. And where do we want to render it? Where that main element is. And lo and behold, the H1 shows up. So that is a very, very simple React component. Now we'd like to do a whole foundation-y form thing in this component. So once your JSX is more than one line, you're going to want to wrap it in parentheses. So I'll just put parentheses there and start my JSX indented on the next line. Now, how about this? Let's put our H1 back. There we go. And let's just put a paragraph underneath that. Where's my paragraph? Uh-oh. I see a red thing. That's bad. Unexpected token. The crap does that mean? Your return statement in render must be one JSX element. It can have as many children as you want, but you can't have adjacent siblings like this. Everything has to be wrapped in a single thing. So we're going to wrap everything in a div. And now it works. But what we're really going to do is we'll put a little bit of foundation-y stuff here. We'll do a class name, not class. Class is a reserved word in JavaScript. Class name of row inside there. Div with the class name of medium offset 2, medium 8, column. Let's get our nice, pretty foundation-y stuff. Let's just stick these in there. Yay. It works. We don't really want this paragraph, though. We want a form. So let's make one real quick. Just a good old form. Is that big enough? Need to be a tad bigger? Okay. And in the form, we'll put an input. Input type equals text. Empty element right. Inputs have no content, so must be self-closing. Don't forget the slash right before the angle bracket, or it will explode. Explode. Expected corresponding JSX closing tag. Yep. And let's put a button. Button type equals submit. Class name. Success. Button. Sign me up. See how that looks? Yay. Let's go ahead and throw that expanded class on there that we make this the full width. Cool. So now it's a form. So how about we add a place for a list that we want to add these things to? We're super into doing that. So I just put another one of these divs underneath. And we'll put an empty UL in there. And we'll use our foundation no bullet class. Nothing in it, right? So what we want to happen is when we add something in the form, it shows up here. And do it the React way. That sounds hard. So we'll do a slightly easier thing first. First, before that UL, let's go ahead and just put in a paragraph. We'll give it, well, we'll just leave it right there. So we need something to happen when something else happens, right? We're in event listening territory. The way we do it in React is a little different. It's a little bit like how we used to do it in the very early days of HTML and JavaScript when that event listener didn't exist. You would actually put stuff in your HTML, like on the form, you would put on submit like that, and just put the name of the function right in there, or actually write the function right in there. And that's kind of how we do things in React. Only React is actually consistent about capitalization, unlike JavaScript. So submit must be capitalized. Everything's going to be camel cased. It will not work otherwise. So you can say on submit and then set it to some function. Now, a quote here, that would be fine if it's a string we're setting it to. But it needs to be set to a function, right? So in JSX, that means we need to use curly braces. And then we can put a JavaScript expression in there. So we want it to call some function somewhere. So we'll add a method to our class to handle this. So render is one of our methods. And just as a general rule, put render at the end. You don't actually have to, but everybody does. So everyone will look there for it. So please make render the very last method of your class, of your component. So let's add another one called handle submit. And we can console, or let's alert so we don't have to mess with the console. Although that's super annoying too. Alert, it worked. So inside on submit, what do you think we should put inside those brackets? You sure that's big enough back there? Okay, seems mighty small. Oh yeah, that's right. Just making sure you remembered, you could see it on your screen. So what do you think I should put inside the brackets if I want to call handle submit? Go ahead, Kai. This dot handle submit. Will work just fine. Now, in this case, in the React world, well, we'll get there. Okay, let's see if that works. Let's put something in here, submit the form. It worked. So we successfully hooked something up. Now, if you've been doing a lot of HTML, JavaScript kind of stuff for a while, it may seem really gross to use on submit. And I do recommend you not do this in your actual HTML. But, and this is one of the things that people like me, React really grossed me out when I first saw it. I was like, mixing the HTML and the JavaScript in the same file? It requires, we separate behavior from presentation. This is horrible. So the whole component thing requires you to approach these problems a little differently. So the idea is you break up the page into lots of little chunks, each of which is a self-contained component. So all the behavior and presentation for just that one little piece of the page will live in this one place, probably a pretty small file. And then it's kind of portable. Plus, you know just where to look when you want to see anything that has to do with, say, this form. So realistically, if we were making this as a serious React app, the form would be one component. Heck, maybe the input itself would be a component, and the list would be a different component, and probably each list item would be a different component. But we're keeping it simple for right now, so we're just making the whole thing one component. But that's the idea. So each of these things would be pretty darn small and just have a little bit of behavior. So yeah, we can kind of get over the fact that we're using onSubmit and stuff. But don't do it with vanilla JavaScript and HTML. So what do we want it to actually do? Maybe put something in the paragraph. How's that sound? So that means we have some data that we need to display on the page, some data that we're going to have to manage. And if we have data that we want to manage, we're going to store it in state. Now, you can also have local variables and so on. This is still just a class. So if you don't actually need it to stick around and do any of the state-like things with it, you don't have to put it in state. In fact, you'll use state fairly little, but you'll use it some. For the really important stuff, the stuff you want to persist. So let's go ahead and use just a wee bit of state. So we'll add a constructor to this class. And you must call the constructor from React component. So you do that with super. So call the same method from the super class. Otherwise, you won't get all the Reacty goodness. And then we'll initialize state, this.state equals some object. And for right now, I'm just going to put Acrobat name in there. Never mind having more than one. Acrobat name, colon, empty string. And what I'll do in handle submit then is set that. Remember, I'm not going to say this.state.acrobat name. I'm going to say this.setState. Pass in an object, Acrobat name, whatever I want it to be. Maybe I can hard code something in here for now instead of grabbing it from the form. Just one little piece at a time. Acrobat name is Jules. Bet you didn't know that. So, to have that show up on the page, what if down here inside this paragraph, I just put curly brace, this dot state dot Acrobat name? So I don't see anything in that paragraph at the moment. But what if I submit the form? I still don't see anything. What happened? We still have to prevent default. So our handler here will still receive an object. It is not an actual DOM event object. It's called a synthetic event. It's a React version of the event. It's just a wrapper around the real event. But it has most of the same properties and methods as regular DOM events. But we are not dealing directly with the DOM in React. React is abstracting all of that and managing it for us using JavaScript objects, which makes it much faster, actually. So if we say ev.prevent default, then we click the button. I still don't see anything. Am I doing something? Alert. Hi. Just make sure that CodePen is actually updated. Yeah, it has. Acrobat name, this.state, Acrobat name. Seth, what am I doing wrong? It is state in this case. So I have state with Acrobat name, empty string. I set state with Acrobat name equal to Jules, and then in a paragraph down here, this.state.acrobat name. It doesn't seem to be doing it. Nope, 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 nope. Thank you. Yep. We do this. We're going to learn several ways to do this, and I'm used to a different way that makes it a little easier, and I haven't done it. I knew I'd forget something. It's been a few weeks. So here's the problem. What's this? One would think, wouldn't one? But now we're in React's world. Let's just maybe alert this. Undefined. This is undefined inside an event handler in React. Why? I mean, it's like they had to go out of their way to do this. But this is what they did. So thanks, React, you big jerk. So we could bind it here. And now it works. Joule shows up in the paragraph. So that was easy. I didn't have to, notice I didn't put a class or anything on this because I didn't have to use a query selector to grab it. I just had to put this little expression inside the paragraph, and this.state.acrobat name was an empty string, so there was just nothing there. It was defined, but it was an empty string. And as soon as it changed, it redrew the page. And that's why we use set state instead of setting state directly again. Because when you set state directly, React doesn't get notified that something changed. So it won't update the DOM. If you set state, it does. So that's really simple. What if we actually want the thing that's in the form? There are, once again, a lot of ways to do this. Just giving it a name, you could do it that way. That's not how people typically do it. You could put an on change on the input instead of an on submit on the form, and then it would just happen as you type. You wouldn't even have to submit first. The way we're going to do it is we're going to add something called a ref, which lets us refer to this thing elsewhere in this class. And ref takes a function. So we're going to put a little arrow function here. And that function is going to receive this input as its argument. I'll just call it input. And that gives us an opportunity to do something like this. This dot acrobat name equals input. Or if you prefer, acrobat name field, just to be really explicit, it'll be the actual input. So this is something you just have to get used to, this pattern. This is how you do this thing. And then this.acrobat name field will be equal to that input, so I can refer to that later, like in my submit handler. So I could say const acrobat name equals, now I have that ref, I called it this dot acrobat name field. And that's the input, so I can say dot value on that. So then I could say set state acrobat name, instead of hard coding the string joules, we just put acrobat name in here. And now it should be whatever we typed in the field. And we still have access to things like current target, even though it's not a real event object. It's a wrapper around it. So I can still say event current target dot reset, because current target will be the form. So let's watch that happen. Lex, yay. Lucas, yay. Sam, I haven't forgotten you. Maniz, I knew all along. I was testing the rest of the class. Now it's replacing the entire paragraph each time, but hey, now we have stuff on the page happening because of something we did in React. And so far this may not seem a whole lot simpler than the way we've been doing it, because to get just a little bit happening takes quite a bit of boilerplate. But let's see about actually creating LIs in our list out of these things. So instead of having state acrobat name, let's have acrobats, and let's make it an array. This dot state dot acrobats. So now the idea is, oh, one more little note, by the way. This is some shorthand that I don't think we've used yet. In ES6, in an object literal, if the name of the variable you're assigning to that key happens to have the exact same name as the key, you can just put that, and then comma and the next thing. So you don't have to write acrobat name colon acrobat name. You can just say acrobat name. But I wanted to write it out explicitly so that we knew what it was at least shorthand for. So take some getting used to, but you'll be glad that for the short syntax before long. But now what we want to do is actually push this thing onto an array, right? Now we're not going to say this dot state dot acrobats dot push or unshift, right? That doesn't work. So we need to make a variable for our array, const acrobats, and we'll go ahead and set it to a copy of what's in this dot state dot acrobats right now. A copy of it, mind you, not the original. Remember objects. All right, did I say it? I only said that in the afternoon. Gosh darn it. Objects are always passed around by reference in JavaScript. That's why a lot of the stuff we've been doing works. Because you may remember back in Jeffervescence, we would say this dot flick dot name equals something else after we edit. And then we didn't have to mess with the array, right? We didn't have to update the array to make sure it had the new copy, because it was modifying the same object the whole time. When we pushed it onto the array, it didn't make a copy of it and store the copy in the array. When we passed flick as an argument to an event handler, it didn't pass a copy of it. It passed the exact same object. So as we changed it there, it changed everywhere. So that's why a lot of that stuff was actually as easy as it was. I know it wasn't necessarily super easy, but it would have been even worse. So if we want to mess with a copy of this, we're gonna have to do something. This is another thing that ES6 actually makes a little easier. Let's say ES6 copy array. Spread syntax. That sounds neat. The spread syntax allows an expression to be expanded in places where multiple arguments for function calls, or multiple elements for array literals, or multiple variables are expected. So ellipsis and then the object. For array literals, ellipsis, the name of the object, comma, more stuff. So basically it breaks apart an array. It gives you each item in the array. So what we can do is set acrobats equal to a new array. And inside that array, we'll break apart the array that's in state using that spread syntax. This dot state dot acrobats. So that will break out all the individual items in that array and wrap them in a new array literal. So we effectively have a copy of it. Now you can't leave off the brackets here, or you'll be setting it to individual items, which doesn't make any sense. So then what we want to do is push what came from the form into that array. So we can say acrobats dot push, or unshift if you like. Now it's in there. So now what do we want to change on state? This dot state dot acrobats is the array. So what do we put here inside the brackets? The key of the thing that I want to change, the key of the thing in this dot state that I want to change, which is acrobats, right? And then what I want to change it to, which is our local variable, acrobats. We want to replace that with this. And we just learned we can shorten that. But let's watch this work first. Then we reset the form. So now down here, this.state.acrobat name isn't a thing anymore. Bye-bye paragraph. It was nice knowing you. It's nothing personal. So we want to render an LI for each item in this.state.acrobats. In English, does that sound like what we want to do? So it sounds like we want to do the same thing to every item in the array. We have this array, this.state.acrobats, and for each one, we want to do the same thing, render an LI. When we want to do the same thing to every item in an array, what method do we use? Map. So inside our UL here, let's just put some curly braces to put in a JavaScript expression. And let's just say this.state.acrobats.map. And then we're going to call some function. We could give it a name, or we could write an arrow function right in here. Let's just write an arrow function. Remember, the first argument to the function will be each item in the array, so a single acrobat, right? And this is going to be a one-liner, so we don't need the curly braces. We can write JSX just like it's JavaScript, as long as we're only returning one thing, right? Go ahead and make this a multi-liner for fun, for right this second. And I'll say return li. And the li will have inside it Acrobat. So this is just a function that returns JSX just like render. And it only returns one element, so that's allowed. So why not? It's essentially returning react.createElement, quote, li, comma, and then the text of the Acrobat. Is it all lies? All right. So let's say something. Let's try Thrifty Boy. Well, there that is. What about Connor? Hey, one on top, one over the other. It worked, right? Yeah, I believe you. Yeah, Dom.
So since you updated the entire Acrobats array, is it smart enough to know that only one item changed in it, so it only rendered one?
Aha.
Or render the entire thing again?
Good question. So we did have to replace the entire thing, right? We made a copy of the array, and then we added something, and then it's essentially a new array now, right? So yeah, anything that depends on this.state.acrobats is going to get redrawn.
So the entire thing together.
Yeah, but it really is very fast. Not necessarily which, okay, explain. Right, which I probably should. If I check my console, I'll have a warning. If I did the real console, I would. But yeah, it kind of abstracts out the console in CodePen, but we'll deal with that. But it's true. You need to uniquely identify the things when you loop over something like this by passing in a key prop. Basically, whatever uniquely identifies each of those things, you're really supposed to include. So I could say li key equals Acrobat, and key in this case is a magic word. or the index of the array. That's true. The second argument to map is the index. I didn't have it there because I wasn't using it, but now I'm using it. So that warning would go away. The warning that I'm not getting because I'm in CodePen.
So basically that way, unless the index changed, it wouldn't re-render that to one.
That's right. Yep. Yeah, the key keeps it from doing that. Thank you. Every time.
The warning, we're not seeing the warning because we're in CodePen. When you actually interact that, it'll give you a warning like, hey, if you're mapping over stuff, maybe you need to keep wrong. It'll still work, but it'll give you that warning until you give it one, because otherwise, yeah, it's being relatively inefficient. You can't have to re-render the whole list anytime list changes.
Yep.
So with the key, it's able to do magic react things and only add the new ones to it?
Yeah. That tells how to uniquely identify everything in the list.
Where did I come from? Is that just part of the map?
Yeah, map always passes in the current element of the array as the first param, the current index as the second, and then it actually passes in the array itself as the third. But we don't need that. And remember, it doesn't enforce the number of parameters, so we just leave it out if we're not going to use it. But I is actually useful here. Yep. Good points. So, some other quick ES6 syntactic sugar notes. Back when we did only have one argument here, we could have left out the parentheses on an arrow function. If you only have one argument to an arrow function, you don't need the parentheses around it. So you'll probably see us do that quite a bit. But since we had more than one, we need the comma. I mean, we need the parentheses and a comma. If you only have one line in an arrow function, you don't need the curly braces. Furthermore, if that one line is the return value, you don't need an explicit return. The arrow function will automatically return that thing. So you can keep it very short. So it's a lot to keep track of the fact that it does all this stuff magically, but if you just get used to arrow functions, it sure does take up a whole lot less space and leaves your code actually quite a bit more readable once you know how to interpret those things. As you scan through, you can see right away what this map does. It just prints out an LI with that Acrobat in it. So if we wanted to, we could have broken this whole thing out into a separate method. We could have made one, again, render should be the last one. We could have made one called render Acrobat. That takes the Acrobat and the index as its arguments and just done the same thing. Return this. And then we don't need the arrow function. We just put this dot render Acrobat. No parentheses, remember. We're actually passing the method in as a parameter. Yeah.
It won't let me scroll over, but I'm curious. In the HTML, do you just have like a div called main?
It's not even a div. It's just an element called main. That's actually one of the HTML5 elements. Yeah, Dom.
Render Acrobat, is it going to be like the normal render method where it has to return a single like container, or can it return multiple?
JSX always has to be a single thing. Yep, you can't put two things right next to each other. So again, it could have children. I could nest things. But yep, it's the same way. So it's not because of the render function, it's because of how JSX works.
Remember when we looked at it without JSX, it was all nested React create on them. You couldn't call them next to each other. They would have to be arguments passed to the previous one.
So it has to return a single value. So again, remember, ES6 object shorthand. Since the value here happens to be in a variable with the exact same name as the key, we can just say Acrobats. So here's a question for you. What if state has some other stuff on it? Like mission, take over the world. And then we set state with just this object in it. Will that still be there? Yes. So when you call set state, it only changes the keys that you pass in, and it leaves the rest alone. So it's not replacing the entire state object with the object that you pass in. It's replacing the things at those keys with what you pass in. So there's quite a bit of non-React stuff going on here, like the spread syntax for breaking out the items in an array, which we use, and this is one of the most common ways of using it, we use to make a copy of that array. Another way you might use it is with arguments to a function, because you can break out an array that way as well, which we will use in the future. We use map to do some cool stuff. We use a ref on this input. Again, other ways we could have done the same thing there. But now we can basically add things to the list. And this, at least, is quite a bit simpler than the way we had to render a list item before. Because what if we did want a class name in all of those? We don't have to call className.add. We just add a class name here. Want a button in this LI? Just put one there. So, it's a little easier than it was, especially before we started cloning that thing out of the HTML, which is kind of why I had you do that. And if you wanted those buttons to have an onSubmit or something, just say button onSubmit. So as things get complicated, it becomes quite a bit easier to do it using a library like React. Question, Dave?
So this part wasn't necessarily too hard doing in JavaScript. The hard part was keeping track of it as objects and doing local storage.
Mm-hmm.
How was that simplified?
So we tried to sort of mimic the way this does it. And I think it is a better way than had we not done that anyway. We have our actual data that's important, and then we have what we're rendering on the page, right? And the data could be synced with something. It could be synced with the database via some API or something, or we were syncing it with local storage. So the thing is, state is a concept that's built in, and there are lots of other people solving the same problems. So there are some pretty dang easy ways of syncing state with something else. Now, managing state can still get a little confusing because it's still this object that holds all your data. But here's the nice thing. Here's why it's simpler. When we need to add a new one, we don't need to remember to add the new LI to the page. We only need to remember to update state. All we do with our code is manage state. React does the work of updating the DOM accordingly. So all we had to do was define that for each thing in the array, we have an LI. And from now on, if we update that array, it updates the DOM with a new LI. And we don't have to remember any of that. We don't have to remember to reattach event handlers to the new ones. If we remove something from the middle of the array, it'll get removed from the middle of the UL. We don't have to do any insert before. We don't have to do any remove element, any of that stuff. So it's the keeping the data in sync with the DOM that becomes so much easier. We basically just have to tell it the rule once, and it keeps track of it. So managing the object is still, managing an object. But keeping it in sync with the DOM is React's job. We don't have to do all that stuff. So, before we had render list item, which we replaced basically with this one thing. And we don't even have to remember to call it, right? When we add a new thing, we don't have to explicitly call render acrobat to add the new one, right? Much less call render acrobat, grab the UL out of the DOM with query selector, and then insert another child. Don't have to do any of that. We just have to change the array. Do you agree that that simplifies things? Okay, you look skeptical. As you see, how much faster we can do a complicated thing. Hopefully it'll start to clear up. Basically, when you've suffered through a lot of things that you do with vanilla JavaScript, you begin to appreciate that this does actually simplify a few things. But state is still kind of a hard concept, and especially the difference between state and props. Props are effectively arguments that you pass from one component to another. And they look like attributes. So that is a very brief introduction to React. Any other questions of that before Seth takes over? With a non-CodePen, slightly more real-world example. Okay.